And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Allison, for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner. I was just here like 2 days ago, so
I know.
I'm back again. So let me talk about how this talk came about. I got a call in late 2017, a guy by the name of Paul Doherty, and I actually owe him an invoice from the Larchmont Library. Larchmont, the home of Joan Rivers, or Joan Molinsky. That's where she grew up, Joan Molinsky. Anyway, he calls me up and he says, hey, I got a recommendation from somebody. And they said, you have a radio and TV background, which I do, as I told you before. And we're doing something on the 50th anniversary of 1968. And we're going to be doing music from 1968, all this other stuff. But we'd like you to do something on 1968 on how television brought everything into the living room, from the Vietnam War, the Smothers Brothers, Rowan and the Martins laughing, to the political conventions, to the assassination. Can you do it? I said, yeah, it's easy. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's not a problem at all. So we start this thing off with Barbara Walters, who was on the Today Show at that point, along with Hugh Downs and an old acquaintance of mine, the late Joe Garagiola, who told me that after his baseball career, he ended up on the Today Show. And he said, that was not only my college education, it was my doctorate education, because nobody wanted to let Barbara down. Barbara worked so hard and was so smart. He said, smartest person that he ever met in TV was Barbara Walters. And so I found this picture of Barbara Walters in front of a television. And I said, yeah, that's it. She's selling a TV on the Today Show. And a lot of people watched the Today Show in 1968. Started back in 1952, and it hasn't changed in 69 years, except for people. And she's putting on the TV, and you got to see body counts at dawn from Vietnam. You got to see protests. You got to learn about the Cold War and space shots throughout the 1960s. But in 1968, there were a lot of things that happened of consequence, like Batman going off the air. I mean, Batman was at the end of the run. Now, let me ask you a question here. In your opinion, if you watch Batman, who was the better Catwoman, Julie Newmar or Eartha Kitt? Anybody want to answer that? There was a method to my madness.
Julie Newmar.
Julie Newmar. We got Julie Newmar's, we got Eartha Kitt. Well, Eartha Kitt was Catwoman, and she was being honored at the White House by Lady Bird Johnson. This is January 19th, 1968. And she was a successful woman. And Lady Bird invited a whole bunch of successful women to the White House to honor them in a luncheon. And Eartha Kitt went up to Lady Bird Johnson and said, why are the boys still in Vietnam? Why are we still there? Turned out to be career suicide for Eartha Kitt, because she was blackballed from the industry in the United States for a long time for the audacity of asking Mrs. Johnson, why did your husband commit troops to Vietnam? That wasn't the only thing that happened that day in Washington. At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, there was it was women's only. It was called the Jeanette Rankin Peace Parade. And they had some goals: end the war in Vietnam, social crisis at home, the social crisis at home being the civil rights movement. And we have two civil rights movements going on at this point. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement that he was leading, and Betty Friedan in the civil rights movement she's leading, women's liberation, which would come to a head in Atlantic City in September of 1968. January 19th, 1968, 87-year-old Jeanette Rankin, who was a congresswoman from Montana who voted against participation in World War I. She got in there in 1916. World War I started in 1917. And you are now here talking about 61 years later. She leads 5,000 women on a march in Washington, D.C. to protest the Vietnam War, to support the civil rights movement. And there was also one other message: sisterhood is powerful. The war in North Korea never ended. In fact, it was never a war. It was a police action. It ended with a truce of sorts in 1953, started in 1950 with the United States and North Korea. So we're 18 years into this thing at this point. In January 23rd, Lloyd Booker had commanded the USS Pueblo, and he's captured by the North Koreans, claiming the ship violated territorial waters while spying. The North Koreans would hold on to Booker and his crew for about a year. They would finally release them, but they haven't released the ship, or never did release the ship. It's now a museum in North Korea showing American espionage. The Tet Offensive, January 30th, the Tet Offensive against the Viet Cong launches the Tet Offensive against South Vietnam. The Viet Cong soldiers attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, but Americans hold off the Viet Cong to the point where an old acquaintance of mine by the name of Richard Nixon, who I met in 1985 for the first time, settling the umpires' dispute in baseball, was campaigning. And he actually thought the Tet Offensive would end the war and that Vietnam would not be much of an issue in the 1968 campaign. But while this is going on, old Iron Pants, this guy, Walter Cronkite, is in Vietnam. And he is assembling a report that he's going to show on February 27th of 1968. By early February 1968, only 35% of Americans approved of the handling of Lyndon Johnson, or Lyndon Johnson's handling of the war. The Vietnam War was played out every day on TV globally. You would see the body counts, or you would hear about the body counts at dawn. Viet Cong, X amount killed, X amount wounded, X amount captured. Americans, X amount killed, X amount wounded, X amount captured or missing in action. So you would see that, and you would also see footage of what was going on in Vietnam. And on the streets, there'd be protests. And this is every day. It's coming right into your living room or your bedroom if you had one or more TVs, which people started assembling in the late 1960s. And Cronkite's report would air on February 27th. But before that, these guys, the Smothers Brothers. Now, as I said back on Tuesday, was it, or Monday? I forgot what day it was when I did the 1967 talk. These guys were brought into CBS to get younger audiences, and they did so. And they got younger audiences with a lot of money, disposable income, with good jobs. And that is what CBS wanted in a viewer. Except CBS didn't want the political view that went with Tommy Smothers and Dickie Smothers and Steve Martin and David Steinberg and Lee French and Mason Williams and a writer by the name of Rob Reiner. They didn't want any part of that at all. And there was also another show that was on, Rowan and Martin's Laughing, not as cutting, not as politically cutting as the Smothers Brothers show, but another show that was against Vietnam. So you got two shows there, which never happened in prime time prior to 1967. There were now anti-war shows on. And the Smothers Brothers in 1968, February of 1968, decided we're going to have Pete Seeger on. Bill Paley said no, chairman of the board of CBS, the founder of CBS with WCAU in Philadelphia in 1927. And he said, absolutely not. He's a communist. He was blacklisted in the 1950s. Absolutely not. But Tommy Smothers was able to prevail and convince Paley and the other people, Dan Wood among others over at CBS, that he could be on. He's okay. There's not a problem. But the memo comes back to Tommy Smothers. Okay, you could have Pete Seeger on. He could be on, but he can't perform one song. And the one song he can't perform is Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. Tommy says, hey, how about that song, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy? Are you going to do it for us? Yes. Seeger performs it on February 25th, 1968, which would set off another battle between CBS censors and the Smothers Brothers. What was so wrong with the song? Well, this. The song was considered symbolic of the Vietnam War and Johnson's policy of escalation, then widely seen as pushing the United States deeper and deeper into an increasingly unpopular war. But the escalation started taking place in 1965 and would reach the plateau in 1968 when 500,000 men and women in uniform for the United States were in Vietnam. A remarkable week of TV also. First week of February. Now, Johnny Carson never really was very political. In fact, he wasn't political at all. He would occasionally tell jokes about, you know, this guy, that guy, that guy, but it wasn't jokes that were satirical in nature, designed to make you think. They were just ha-ha jokes. Johnny was sensing there was something going on in the country. And he talked to Harry Belafonte, said, I'm going on vacation. How would you like to host the show for a week? Harry said yes. And you could see on this show, Harry is talking to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Paul Newman is there as well. And Ed McMahon is there listening. And for an entire week, first week of February, February 5th through 9th, among the guests, Newark's Dionne Warwick, she's from New Jersey, Aretha Franklin, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, Lena Horne, Diane Carroll, Nipsey Russell, who marched with Dr. King, Bill Cosby, folk singer Buffy St. Marie, Aaron Williams, Freda Payne, and they talked about what was going on in the country. And it was something different from the Tonight Show. There wasn't, here's Johnny. No, it was serious stuff that week. And there was stuff that you might have seen on Mike Douglas or Merv Griffin, but certainly not in primetime TV at the time. It was the only time the Tonight Show ever did anything like this. And they discussed issues before viewers, and Johnny would get 20, 30 million viewers sometimes, before viewers in the United States. Now, Cronkite, Old Iron Pants, February 27th. Report from Vietnam is on. And it is said to have played a major role in turning Americans against the war and inducing Lyndon Johnson to abandon his re-election campaign. Johnson's running for re-election. Bobby Kennedy is not in the race quite yet on February 27th. It would be Johnson, it would be Eugene McCarthy, who wanted to get the troops out of Vietnam, and then you had George Wallace, who was running as the segregationist candidate, no longer as part of the Democratic Party. He's part of an independent movement, and he would go ahead and run for president in 1968. And there is Lyndon Johnson, who was just running against McCarthy in February of 1968. Now, you probably, I'll ask this question anyway, if anybody wants to put in the chat, they can. Why is February 12th, 1968 an important day in American history other than being Lincoln's birthday, which has seen its better days as far as a holiday, deteriorated, I meant to say, over the years. Anyway, anybody have any idea why February 12th is so important? Well, the Memphis sanitation strike would start on February 12th. It would last until April 16th, but something happened during that strike, which would impact American history to this day. In London, there was a demonstration on March 17th against the United States involvement in Vietnam. There would be violence, 91 people injured, 200 demonstrators arrested. It would also be the day that Robert F. Kennedy would enter the race for president or Democratic nomination. And Richard Nixon is in Oregon. He had just won the Oregon primary. And he said, oh, I don't like those Kennedys. Something always strange happens around those Kennedys. So Robert Kennedy is in the race. March 31st, the US President Lyndon Johnson announces he's not going to seek re-election. And it is 5 historic days that we have begun to start, March 31st through April the 4th. Some say from those days that Johnson decided not to run again for re-election because he saw Walter Cronkite on TV on February 27th. And he felt, because Cronkite said, we're not going to win this war. The best we could do is a stalemate. So the story went was that Johnson decided he was going to quit. But I once asked Larry O'Brien about that, who was Johnson's liaison in Congress when he was the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, about David Halberstam in his book saying that Johnson quit because he lost Cronkite. And Larry said no. He said Lyndon would not quit because he lost Walter Cronkite. However, there may be some credence in that, because when Johnson got upset at the Smothers Brothers, he calls up Bill Paley, the CBS chairman, and says, hey, get them off my back. Do something about it, which Paley tried to do. April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated at the Hotel Lorraine in Memphis, Tennessee, 6:01 Central Time that night. And that is my wife walking through the Martin Luther King Center in 2015, where you could actually, in facsimile form, go through all of the walks and the marches that took place through the South, and you're with the people who were marching with Dr. King, wounded Vietnam veteran missing a leg, an average housewife, an average young guy, an average older guy, and you can take that walk. And there is me in front of where Martin Luther King is buried.
Oh, that's right.
April 4th, 1968, Robert Kennedy is in Indianapolis, and it's a campaign stop. And Robert Kennedy is credited with keeping the lid down on the violence in Indianapolis by saying this: for those of you who are Black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times. With that talk in Indianapolis, all the violence was quelled in Indianapolis with that talk. So I'm hearing feedback here, which
someone's talking. They should mute.
Yeah. Okay. I just muted it. Okay. All right. So anyway, so Indianapolis, there's not too many problems going on, but across the country, there's a whole bunch of problems going on, whether it would be Harlem, whether it would be in New Jersey. It was going on around the country, except in one place. I feel good. James Brown. James Brown, the hardest working man in show business, the godfather of soul. He's in Boston, and he's supposed to be giving a concert, and Kevin Walsh, the mayor there, nobody's sure if this thing should go on, whether or not James Brown, because of all the tension going around the country, with the exception of Indianapolis. And James Brown says, no, I'm going to do this concert. I think I can handle this. And he's at the concert, and there's some milling and pushing and shoving going around. James Brown says, wait a minute, now wait, step down, now be a gentleman. And I've asked the police to step back because I think I could get some respect from my own people. Brown successfully restores order while keeping the police away from the crowd. James Brown is credited with putting a lid on possible violence in Boston. Meanwhile, there is Martin Luther King, and with him is Jackie Robinson, and they are talking in an old picture.
Hi, sorry, Evan, excuse me. There's some extraneous background noise. I'm not sure if everybody's been muted.
I just muted
Pardon
everybody.
me. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, so there's Martin Luther King, and there's Jackie Robinson. And Martin Luther King held Jackie Robinson in extremely high respect. Jackie Robinson played about 16 Major League Baseball games, if you haven't forgotten, or actually less. He played 8 Major League Baseball games when the Brooklyn Dodgers played in 1956 and 1957 in Jersey City. So he actually played Major League Baseball in Jersey City. when the Dodgers were trying to figure out where they should play after Evans Field. Anyway, Martin Luther King looked up to Jackie Robinson and all that he endured. Jackie Robinson was a Brooklyn Dodger in 1947, signed with the organization in 1945. The Brooklyn Dodgers franchise ended up in Los Angeles when Walter O'Malley moved them after the 1957 season. Now, flash forward to the 1968 season, and Major League Baseball is in a dither. They have no idea what to do following the assassination of Martin Luther King. On the morning of April 9th, Walter O'Malley, the Los Angeles Dodgers owner, met with Buzzy Babese, the general manager of the Los Angeles Dodgers, and said, we're finally going to postpone our opening game. Every other team in Major League Baseball at that time, there were 20 teams, so there would be 10 games. 9 of those 10 games were postponed on April 9th, with the exception of the Dodgers. Now, the Philadelphia Phillies put an awful lot of pressure on the Los Angeles Dodgers and O'Malley to make the decision, because Phillies first baseman Bill White, who was the New York Yankee announcer eventually, and then the National League National League president in the 1980s, was leading the Philadelphia Phillies players and saying, we're not showing up for this game, and we're not going to relent. We'll take a forfeit. As Bill White once told me many years ago, he said, Dr. King made it easier for me. And Bill White would tell me about in the South when he was a player in the 1950s, even in 1962 when he was a player with the St. Louis Cardinals. They couldn't stay at a certain hotel in St. Petersburg like their white teammates did. So he was not going to disrespect Dr. King, and he got all his Philadelphia Phillies teammates to say, we're not showing up. So Walter O'Malley was not going to get a baseball game that day, whether or not he wanted it. The Philadelphia Phillies were not going to play the Los Angeles Dodgers. There is a scene in Washington, D.C., buildings burning. The National Guard on the streets in Washington, D.C. It was the greatest wave of social unrest the United States experienced since the Civil War. Some of the biggest riots took place in Washington, D.C., in Baltimore, in Kansas City, in Chicago, and in pockets of New Jersey, and certainly in New York City and elsewhere around the country. Through it all, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968 into law shortly after Martin Luther King was killed. That was passed in April of 1968, effectively prohibiting housing discrimination based on race. One thing I'm going to add about the killing of Martin Luther King on April 4th in Memphis. The night before, he gave a talk, and that was, I've seen the Mountain Talk. And it was, if you go into the King Center and you listen to that speech, it was Martin Luther King seemingly saying goodbye. Been to the mountaintop, time to pass on the torch. And passing on the torch was becoming exceedingly difficult for the civil rights movement, which began to splinter in 1966. The Vietnam War. Does the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? I was giving a talk over in Whippany, or Persephone rather, at a senior's home, Lester's Tower. And I said, does the name Mark Rudd ring a bell? Because I was doing this talk. And this woman said, yeah, I knew Mark. I knew his mother and father. They lived here. And she started telling me all about Mark Rudd. Well, if Mark Rudd doesn't ring a bell, let me introduce you to Mark Rudd, because he was the leader of the Students for Democratic Society at Columbia University. Mark, a New Jersey native, led the student protests, which shut down Columbia University between April 23rd and April 30th. Rudd and his group took over administration buildings and literally shut down the university, which when I was doing this talk on a cruise ship in 2017, there was a guy who looked like Albert Einstein in the back who was getting inflamed as I was talking about. They said, I was a graduate student at Columbia. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? They shut down the school. Where was I supposed to study? That was the library. How was I supposed to get out of there? That was his problem. And everybody else booed him. About 300 people in the audience said, you booed him, shut up, shut up. In France at that time, there was a general strike. all those strife in the United States taking place, the stuff going on in England and here in France, stop the unconditional bombing by the U.S. in North Vietnam. The French, of course, got out of Vietnam in 1954, and that became a civil war. And France washed its hands of Indochina at that time. That was it. We're out of here. And the United States started to fill the void in little by little by little by little by little. And Eisenhower recommended in 1960 to John F. Kennedy, this was during the transition, that maybe, just maybe, you should consider sending troops there. Eisenhower had considered sending troops to Vietnam in 1954. My father might have gone there, and then he said, no, we're not going to do it. He was in the Army at the time. There were demonstrations, massive general strikes, occupations of universities and factories in France. The problem, inequality in wages. Women wanted more rights in France. And de Gaulle would eventually sit down with the strikers and say, okay, here's a series of reforms. We will implement these reforms, but we're going to have an election in 1969. Well, we'll have the vote in 1969. If I win, my package wins, I stay. If my package loses, I go. De Gaulle was gone in 1969. Robert F. Kennedy. I was 12 years old when he was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles back on June 5th, 1968. In fact, I was at PS10, junior high school in Queens. And we went up to Stratford, Connecticut that day because we were going to the Globe Theater up there and Shakespeare. And that was part of our English package that we had to see As You Like It. I have two tangential, and I was going to say impacts, but tangentially, I have two things that tie me to this assassination. One is a guy by the name of Shelley Saltman, and one is an interview I did with Rosie Greer, the former New York Giants, Los Angeles Rams defensive lineman, who was Bobby Kennedy's bodyguard. Now, there is always the question whether or not Bobby Kennedy would have won the Democratic nomination. I've talked to people over the years. The answer is probably not, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But my friend Shelley, the late Shelley Saltman, who, among other things, in 1973 was the promoter of the Bobby Riggs, Billie Jean King Battle of the Sexes, and also was beaten up by Evel Knievel. He grew up with the Kennedys in Boston. He used to play football with Teddy Kennedy in the Commons. He was, at that point, a promoter, part owner of the Phoenix Suns, and he was also promoting golf tournaments. And one of the tournaments that he promoted every year was the Andy Williams San Diego Open. So he and Andy Williams had a relationship. And Andy Williams was Bobby Kennedy's best friend. And Shelley gets a call from him that morning of the primary. He says, the California primary, he says, listen, Bobby needs a spot just to get away. He's got to write either he won speech or a concession speech for that night. Do you have a place for him? Where can you store him where nobody will know where he is and he won't be able to be reached by anybody? And Shelley says, you know my office, you know my secretary. Why don't you just call the office, tell my secretary, and just she'll put Bobby in my office. And Bobby wrote his last two speeches at my friend Shelley's desk. The other is Rosie Greer, who about 1982, 1983, somewhere around there, 1982, 1983, was selling a book. He was a knitter. He was knitting sweaters and all that other stuff. And sometimes as a reporter, to get to where you want to go, you have to play the game. And the game is the PR guy is giving you Rosie Greer, and you better ask the question about the book, which you have no intentions of doing anything with anyway, but you have to do it because the PR guy, that's his job and all that other nonsense. But then I got to the question, how did you knock the gun out of Sirhan's hand? Now, Rayford Johnson, who recently passed away, and Rosie Greer, who's still alive, were Bobby Kennedy's bodyguards. And Shelley told me Bobby was not a big guy, maybe 5'7", and Rosie was a mountain of a man, 6'5", over 300 pounds. Rafer, a big guy, decathlon, won the decathlon in the Olympics. So you figure Bobby could be hidden in between those two guys. Well, this is where he gives this, the hey, we won speech. That's what he's doing. And I've done this because I've covered political events. Bill Clinton was the last presidential event that I covered on the campaign in 1992. And you would go through, these guys would go through back doors, kitchens, pantries, whatever. And he goes through the back door, kitchen, pantry to get out. Sirhan is waiting for him. Rosie Greer's with him, and Rafer Johnson. And the shots ring out. Rosie's right next to Bobby, and being an old defensive lineman, he just goes right after Sirhan. I asked him, did you have any time to think? He said, I have no idea what I did. I just reacted. And Bobby is on the floor. And Rosie still carries that with him all these years later, along with Sonny Fox, who hosted Wonderama back in the day. I was with Sonny years ago, and he was telling me, because Bobby was on Wonderama, the Channel 5 show, every year, 65, 66, 67. Sonny never got over the assassination as well. Assassination takes place. He dies the next day. Shelley is part of the staff that puts together the funeral, and also that he was part of the final train ride from St. Patrick's Cathedral to Arlington National Cemetery. Would Bobby have won? Well, I've talked to people about Bobby and his inclusion in the 1968 campaign. He came really late, came in March. He didn't have much of an organization. He had Jerry Springer, believe it or not. He had Jerry Springer. He had Jeff Greenfield. He had Bob Arum, who I know as a boxing promoter. Those guys were all really young guys in their 20s at that point. He assembled a lot of young guys, gung-ho. But the thought was that he knew he wasn't going to get the nomination in 68 for various reasons. I'll get into the reasons in a couple of minutes. But this was, let's get this thing going for 72, because if Johnson does win, when he entered the race, Johnson was still in there, he's not going to be able to run again in 72. Let us position ourselves to be the front runners in 1972 or going against Hubert Humphrey. Prague Spring, Czechoslovakia, January of 1968. Some rules were loosened in Czechoslovakia, and that was on a cruise ship now almost 3 years ago. A celebrity ship going through the Caribbean, and I put this picture up, and I'm in one of the side lounges, which was a good thing for this talk instead of the main theater. And there was a woman. She was in her 70s, maybe 80s, and she was sitting in a walker, and she was only about 6-7 feet away from me. So whatever she said, I could hear her, and I put up that picture, and she said, it was beautiful. And I looked at her. I said, it was beautiful. She said, yeah, it was beautiful. I said, were you there? She said, yes, I was. I was in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia. And it was August 20th when it went down. But she said that when they got some freedom, they were able to get some visas that she could travel, and that visa would come in handy in 1968. So she said she was able to listen to the poets recite poetry at the cafes in Bratislava, and also the guitar players singing their songs, and people didn't look over their shoulder to make sure they were saying the right thing or who they were talking to, all that other stuff. She said it was great. And then she says, it's 11 o'clock at night in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia, and she's living with her mother. Now, let me just, why is she living with her mother? They were Holocaust survivors. And they were able to survive because Raoul Wallenberg, she was the first Raoul Wallenberg saver, or savee that I ever met, that Raoul Wallenberg got her out of trouble, and they hid for a while, and then they were able to go back to Czechoslovakia, she and her mother. So her mother is hearing noises outside, and she says, oh, why are there planes flying overhead in Bratislava, Czechoslovakia at 11 o'clock at night on August 20th? And then her mother goes to the curtains, moves the curtains, and looks in the streets and says, Why are there tanks going through Bratislava, Czechoslovakia at 11 o'clock on August 20th? With that, it was over. The Soviet Union put the boot to the neck of the Prague Spring. And this woman surprisingly said, she said, yeah, we lost freedom. But she said, the people I really felt sorry for were the Soviet troops. Why? Because it was hot, they were thirsty, they had no water, and if you gave them some water, just being humanitarian, they would get shot on the spot. The woman herself, she and her mother had the visas, and they were scheduled to go to Brussels for a holiday in October of 1968. And instead of going to the hotel when they got to Brussels, they made a left, as she said, instead of a right, went right to the US Embassy, declared that they were seeking asylum, that they had sponsors in Skokie, Illinois. This woman was from Chicago. And within 72 hours, they started a new life. Meanwhile, the Soviets did put the boot to the neck, and there were some uprisings between then, August 20th, and January, and in January they finally put the lid on the freedom. The Prague Spring began on January 5th, 1968. Alexander Dubček was elected the first secretary of the Communist Party. That would continue officially until August 21st. Many years later, Dubček, who resigned in 1969, was found dead, a mysterious death that has never been solved. Pol Pot, Cambodia, the killing fields. He, in 1968, forms the Khmer Rouge, all part of what's going on in Indochina, as it was called in those days, with Cambodia and Laos in North and South Vietnam, Thailand there as well. The Khmer Rouge, officially formed in 1968, and its forces launched an insurgency around Cambodia. And Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese provide shelter and weapons to the Khmer Rouge. These guys in 1968 decide to join the Fokies and start complaining about the Vietnam War. Paul McCartney on the left, George Harrison in the middle, John Lennon on the right, Ringo Starr on drums. And John Lennon writes a song which is somewhat incoherent when you listen to it today, called Revolution. It wasn't exactly against the Vietnam War. It's kind of hard to figure out what exactly it's for or against when you read the lyrics. But it was a protest song of some point. It wasn't as direct as the next song he would write about protests in 1969, Give Peace a Chance. But this brings up a question that Rich Lee, formerly of New Jersey, who is part of a think tank in New Jersey, who is now teaching at St. Bonaventure's University in Olean, New York, and has formed a think tank up there. He asks the question, and he gives a talk called, was rock music the soundtrack of global protest, yes or no? The answer, of course, could be yes, for the most part, The rock musicians, like the Beatles, like The Who, and others, replaced Bob Dylan or Joan Baez or Tom Paxson and Pete Seeger and Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Fokies, as the people speaking out against the war. Phil Oakes, another one. The cultural protest because of the Beatles, the cultural protest merged with political demonstrations, and anti-war songs are written. And that would include Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and after Kent State in 1970, and Stephen Stills and others who wrote political protest songs. This man is smiling. Oh yeah, I won it. I won it. There is, of course, Richard Nixon of Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. That's where he lived out his life. And the guy got behind him, Gerald Ford, the congressman from Michigan, with that, I know something's going to happen smile. Take a look at Ford's smile, and Nixon, oh, I am going to be the president. And there's Nixon. So Nixon gets the Republican nomination. Meanwhile, Pegasus the Pig gets the nomination of the Yippie Party to run for president in Chicago. Nixon is out in California. And there is Pegasus the Pig. And he's being arrested at a demonstration after he just got the nomination to run for president of the United States. The political theater, known as the Yippies, that's the Jerry Rubin group, the Yippies. How many of you were Yippies? back in the day. I was too young. I was 12 years old. Youth International Party nominate a pig for president. It's August 23rd. It's in Chicago. And in Chicago, the Democrats are about ready to have their presidential nomination convention. Pegasus was arrested along with Piglet and his children and her children with Jerry Rubin and others for disorderly conduct. Now, we don't know what happened to Pegasus. There's one group that says he was dinner that night at the police station. There's another group that says he was sent out to Iowa and lived out the rest of his life at a pig farm in Iowa. Hubert Humphrey by now is the standard bearer for the Democrats, Robert Kennedy being killed, Eugene McCarthy not really getting any traction, and George Wallace running not as a Democrat. So Hubert Humphrey is going to get the nomination. And he probably, if Robert Kennedy survived, would still have gotten the nomination because Lyndon Johnson hated the Kennedy faction, just hated the Kennedys. And it was his people. Humphrey was his person, and he was supposed to run, he being Lyndon Johnson. So the apparatus was all set up for Lyndon Johnson. Kennedy was trying to build his own apparatus. And again, from what it was told to me, it was for 1972, not for 1968. That was a dry run for a 1968 run. There were protests in the streets of Chicago outside of the convention. The convention was held in the amphitheater, which was in the middle of the meatpacking part of Chicago. So you had that stench as well going on in that area. Vietnam is the significant issue of the day. That is the Hilton Hotel, or in front of the Hilton Hotel in Chicago. And on that cruise ship that that woman from Bratislava was on were 5 or 6 other people from Chicago that saw my talk. And there was one woman who was on top of the Hilton Hotel where the action was going to take place, in front of the Hilton Hotel. And she said that she was watching from her room. She didn't tell me why she was there, but she was there. And she said, you could see the police moving this way and the protesters moving that way, and the protesters yelling, the whole world is watching, and the police moving and the protesters moving, both sides itching for a fight. And she said she just looked down at what was going on. There was another guy who was there, and I was asking people in Chicago, tell me what you thought about what was going on. And he said, I was upset. I said, well, why were you upset? He said, they closed Grand Field. I said, Grand Park, rather. I said, well, they have a convention going on with all that. He said, yeah, but I couldn't play softball. And I looked at him, I said, how old were you? 16. I said, you were the guy who brought the Ham's beer. Ham's brother, Pete Ham's beer. Ham beer, which you probably don't know about in Georgia. Ham beer. And he said, how'd you know? And then there was another guy who started singing the Ham beer commercial. So we all started to sing while we're talking about the Democratic Convention on the cruise ship somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean. Anyway, the whole world is watching. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin vowed to lead Vietnam War protesters to Chicago, to the amphitheater, to disrupt the convention. And the mayor of the city, Richard Daley, who during the Martin Luther King riots, after Martin Luther King was killed, told his police, shoot to kill, you're not going to stay in our city, is led to believe that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin are going to get this big dump truck, and it's going to be loaded with LSD, which was just made illegal a couple of years before in Nevada and California and other places, because it could send you on trips. And he thought they were going to dump all of this LSD into the water supply in Lake Michigan, and you were going to end up having people of Chicago acting like Groucho Marx, who was one of the first proponents of LSD when it was invented back in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. So Daley is now all paranoid because he's got demonstrations, and he thinks that he's going to have a city filled of acid heads, and so he's trying to figure out what he is supposed to do, and he's going to take his police department and tell them, you know what, we don't want any disruption of the city or to sully the city's name. At the convention itself, Mike Wallace and Gunga Dan Rather, were roughed up inside of the convention. They were roughed up. And let me give you a difference between television and journalism of 1968 and what passes for journalism today, which is now known in the business informally as infotainment. Part information and a lot of entertainment. That's what it's known as in the business. And I've done those shows, so I know. Make sure you do good TV. Make sure you do good TV, compelling TV. How about facts? Make sure you do good TV. I've been told that. Anyway, I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, if I may be permitted to say so. Walter Cronkite, during the Democratic National Convention in 1968, asking your opinion if he could say that. On August 28th, TV cameramen, Conrad Hilton Hotel, turn their cameras down on the crowd. Crowd is chanting, "The whole world's watching, the whole world's watching. Are we ready to rumble?" Yes, we are. And they did. And there were many arrests. And the Chicago Tribune newspaper, which was once owned by Colonel McCormick, who was a member of the America First Committee, and had Bob Novak as one of their writers, hardly a bastion of liberal journalism, hardly that. But this is what they said about Chicago. Many convention visitors were appalled at what they considered unnatural enthusiasm of police for the job of arresting demonstrators. And oh, there is Dick Daley, Richard Daley. Richard Daley is not too happy. He's not thrilled at all because Abraham Ribicoff, a Connecticut senator, is speaking at the Democratic Convention, and he is so upset. He is so upset, and he gives the cutthroat signal to Abraham Ribicoff, because Ribicoff was trying to curtail the voices of those speaking out against the war and also those speaking out against the police action in Chicago. And Ribicoff accuses Daley and the Chicago police of using Gestapo tactics against the demonstrators. And that got Daley really upset, and he gives Ribicoff the cutthroat sign. Meanwhile, 8 are arrested. The Chicago 8 initially: Abby Hoffman, Tom Hayden, David Dillinger, Rennie Davis, John Freunage, Jerry Rubin, Lee Weiner, no relation, and Bobby Seale. Seale's antics in the courtroom got him separated from the others, so the Chicago 8 became the Chicago 7. In February of 1975, of the remaining 7 Chicago conspiracy, or people accused of the conspiracy, were convicted of intent to incite a riot while crossing state lines. Those convictions were eventually reversed on appeal in 1971. Meanwhile, here are some women who are determined to go to Atlantic City and get their cause across the country. And these women are in New York City, and they are the New York Radical Women. On August 22nd, 1968, the New York Radical Women invited women of every political persuasion to the Atlantic City Boardwalk on September 7th, the day of the Miss America contest. They would protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses every woman in every area in which it purports to represent us. And they were even going to protest Burt Parks. How could you protest Burt Parks singing "There She Is"? But they were. Now, they came up with a slogan. The slogan, "Burn your bra." And a couple of years ago, when I was doing the 1968-1969 talk, I was at a seniors residence in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I asked the question, being politically incorrect as I am, and I'm looking at the room, it's a senior's place, I said, "How many of you burned your bra?" There was no silence in the room. You might think there'd be silence, that people would be shocked. No, there wasn't. There was one woman saying, "You're a man. You don't understand the bra. A bra, it's expensive. It's really expensive, and it takes forever to find one that fits correctly. You think I'm crazy enough to burn a bra?" Another woman said, "I burn my own old bras." The burn a bra slogan actually was a very, very, very effective political slogan. It got men involved, not for the reason that you would think. They're just looking at purely from the Hugh Hefner viewpoint. But it works because men start listening to why women are burning their bras in the 1968-69 area. The protest in Atlantic City would feature a Freedom trash can. Why a trash can? Because the cops didn't want anybody to burn anything on the boardwalk, which might have ignited a bigger fire. So there was the Freedom trash can instead of burning your bra. But in that trash can, women could throw away all the physical manifestations of women's oppression, such as bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, representative issues of Cosmopolitan, the magazine that had Burt Reynolds in there, a couple years later, Ladies' Home Journal, Family Circle, etc. And there is the Freedom trash can on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And take a look at behind the ABC reporter. Take a look to her left. There is a woman wearing a bra outside of her dress, which means that that bra is going to end up in that Freedom trash can. If the authorities weren't there, it would have gone up in smoke, but it wasn't. And you can see these two women here are throwing out other things of oppression. Now, the protests didn't change the Miss America pageant, and we would have Burt Parks for about another decade before they threw him out. Can you believe they threw out Burt Parks? They threw him out. Johnny Carson tried to get him back, and they wouldn't listen to Carson. They just kicked Burt Parks to the curb. Burt Parks lived up in Greenwich, Connecticut. I know people who knew him. They said he was such a sweetheart, such a nice guy, Burt Parks. But anyway, the 1968 protests didn't change the Miss America pageant, but they did introduce feminism into the mainstream consciousness and expanded the national conversation about the rights and liberation of women. And that slogan was one hell of a slogan because people paid attention because burn your bra. Why is that man smiling? Well, why am I smiling? Dan Rowan and Dick Martin. Richard Nixon was on Rowan and Martin's Laughing and uttered famous words. Now, Nixon changed presidential politics in 1960 by looking terrible and John Kennedy looking great in the first debate in Chicago in 1960 between Nixon and Kennedy. Nixon learned TV quickly afterwards. He would hook up with Roger Ailes, so he would really learn TV. Ailes was with the Mike Douglas show, and then Nixon said, you ought to become a political consultant. Ailes was a television genius. But anyway, he's invited on Rowan and Martin's Laughing. And he's asked to say those words, sock it to me, sock it to me, sock it to me, 4 words. And with that, it's okay for a presidential candidate to show another side. And Bill Clinton would eventually be on Arsenio Hall playing the saxophone, and other candidates would go on other shows, showing a different side to them, not the serious side of them, as they're running for president, vice president, Arnold Schwarzenegger's case, governor, and other offices. That's Richard Nixon's contribution to pop culture. The Smothers Brothers continue to be in trouble. They have to submit their shows 10 days in advance of an air date so the censors could thoroughly vet them. And that means the first show of the 1968 season, which featured Harry Belafonte, well, there would be some major surgery done to that show. Pat Paulson, though, was on the show. Pat Paulson was reading editorials. He was the presidential candidate, and he made a living out of being a presidential candidate, 68, 72, 76, 80, 84. He was just a guy who hung around the office, and they decided, hey, let's use him. He'll be our presidential candidate. Satirical. He beat Stephen Colbert, who was running for president by decades. And he'd read an editorial, and the editorials would make no sense, doublespeak, but they were great. And I used to send away for them, and I have no idea what happened to them. I sent a self-addressed stamped envelope to Smothers Brothers show, and I got them back. And, you know, it's been 53 years, so I have no idea what happened to that. But Harry Belafonte was supposed to be on that opening show, and he was supposed to be singing a song about over a montage of what happened at the Democratic Convention. It was 4.5 minutes. CBS cut it out and replaced it with 4.5 minutes of infomercials for Richard Nixon. 4.5 minutes of Richard Nixon political campaign commercials instead of Harry Belafonte on a show where the Smothers Brothers show, presumably the audience did not like Richard Nixon. Meanwhile, the more things change, the more things stay the same. That's Jose Feliciano, and he sings the national anthem before the Detroit Tigers, St. Louis Cardinals, Game 5 of the 1968 World Series. Jose was a young guy then, had long hair. What the viewers didn't know who were watching on TV was he was blind. It was never said on TV that he was blind for people watching the game. And he had a seeing eye dog at his feet, a guide dog. And look at the guys playing the national anthem with him. They look like they're they're there at the polka dance at a VFW club. But the problem with Jose Feliciano, according to people who complained about Jose Feliciano, was pretty simple. He's from Puerto Rico. So why was this non-American, even though he is an American citizen, non-American singing the national anthem, and why is he doing it in a calypso beat, Latin jazz twist? Well, he did. And the NBC switchboard, because NBC was doing the game, lit up like a Christmas tree with people complaining. Irate callers thought Feliciano's version of the national anthem was unpatriotic. Meanwhile, the Tiger Stadium crowd responded immediately with both cheers and boos. And if you are a baseball fan, you know who Ernie Harwell was. He was the Detroit Tigers announcer, and he had seen, he was a jazz buff, and he had seen Feliciano somewhere else, and he recommended to the Detroit Tigers, let's bring him in to sing the national anthem. And that caused some problems. Last year, or actually 2018 on the 50th anniversary of that Star Spangled Banner, Jose Feliciano did a reprise of the Star Spangled Banner in Detroit. Meanwhile, trouble in Mexico. And this is never, ever, the true story of this has never come out officially in Mexico. Mexico was hosting the 1968 Olympics, and they decided they were going to clean up the country. No protest. We don't want any protest. Everything is going to be great. Follow the yellow brick road. Everybody's going to have a really good time at the Olympics. But there were some problems in Mexico: inequality in wealth, education, women, the gender inequality, stuff from the 1960s. There was a group called the CNH, and it was made up of students from 70 universities and preparatory schools. And they decided to coordinate a huge protest in early October in the main square in Mexico City, and the protest designed to highlight the need for social and education and political reforms. It's October 2nd. There are about 10,000 students gathered in the plaza, and they're protesting the government, and they're listening to speeches, and the Mexican government decides this has to end, and it has to end soon. We can't have this anymore, so they start sending helicopters in, shooting off flares, and then 5,000 soldiers attacked the square with 200 tanks, trucks surrounding the plaza. Many would die, many would be arrested. Officially, the Mexican government still sticks to the story. They haven't changed the story, that they were there because they know that these groups were going to turn on each other and they were going to be violent against each other. So they were there to protect the protesters, and because they had to protect the protesters and separate them, some of them got in the way, some were killed, and some were arrested. Meanwhile, the Olympics do come off in the next couple of weeks, and there is the protest by Tommy Smith in the middle, John Carlos on the right, and Peter Norman on the left. For a minute, I'm going to leave out Smith and Carlos because Peter Norman's story is compelling. If you see all three of them, they're wearing a badge. And that was Olympic Athletes for Human Rights type of badge at that point. That was organized by a guy by the name of Harry Edwards, who actually put pressure on to cancel the 1968 Olympics. There is a link between him and Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee in 2016. I, over the years, have gotten to know Harry a little bit. You know, he's 6'9" and 300 pounds, so you're not going to miss him. But Peter Norman was from Australia, and he supported the Human Rights Project, and he supported Smith and Carlos. In fact, he suggested to Smith and Carlos after the race, he came in second, Carlos third, Tommy Smith won the race. Split your gloves. One glove for somebody, one glove the other somebody, and raise your fist. Black power salute, sort of, but not really. The Americans, if you look, John Carlos is wearing beads around his neck to symbolize lynching. And they're not wearing shoes, symbolizing global poverty and also hunger. And Norman is involved in this protest, and the Australians don't like this. And when he goes back to Australia, he becomes literally a non-entity, a non-citizen. He qualifies for the 1972 Olympics, and he's kicked off the team. Why? Because he supported Carlos and Smith. The three were supporting the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Smith and Carlos had their badges. Norman had to, a friend of his had a badge, and he put it on. It would be in 2012, 6 years after Peter Norman died, that the Australian Parliament would apologize to him for the way they treated him over the years. When he died in 2006, Smith and Carlos were two of his pallbearers. His family said, this does us a lot of good, right? 6 years after his death, oh yeah, here's an apology for the way we treated you. Smith and Carlos went on to be educators. Smith is friendly with actually my cousin, who went to Oberlin University, and he played football at Oberlin in track and field, and Tommy was the track and field coach there, so they developed a friendship. Tommy Smith, the ultimate protester, ironically enough, would end up playing professional football with the pre-NFL merger Cincinnati Bengals of the American Football League, not quite yet in the National Football League in 1969. Here is the ultimate protester during the national anthem, when that protest takes place on the podium, and yet he plays in the National Football League, the American Football League, but really the National Football League, because the leagues had merged by that point. John Carlos would be drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles, would never play for that NFL team because of an injury, and would play briefly with the Montreal Alouettes in the Canadian Football League. Both of them went on to be educators. Both were just honored by the U.S. Olympic Committee for their bravery in 1968 and their protest. Nixon's the one. Richard Nixon wins the presidential election in November of 1968. There has been some suggestion that Nixon, along with the widow of Claire Chennault, interfered with American Vietnamese peace talks prior to the election, saying, wait till we're elected and then we'll give you a better deal. It's been suspected that it was done, but it's never been proven that he was done. Claire Chennault was a World War II military hero over the Burma Hump, the Flying Tigers. He passed away, and his wife and Nixon allegedly cooked up some scheme that's never been proven. Hubert Humphrey loses. George Wallace may have siphoned off electoral votes from Hubert Humphrey, but Nixon wins. Winning is more fun, says a tearful Hubert Humphrey. And look at the bottom of the Toronto Daily Star, the Toronto Star these days. Ottawa worried Nixon policy could hit us in the pocketbook. That was before NAFTA and before they redid treaties. They just recently redid a treaty. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Hubert Humphrey, why did he lose? Well, possibly because he didn't break with his boss, Lyndon Johnson, on the course of the Vietnam War. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 1968. Elvis is back, and he's back in leather, and he's not making those movies. They are so bad they're good, or they're really so bad. I don't want to offend anybody, but when I see an Elvis movie, I start laughing because it is so basically bad. They're great. They're great to laugh at. So Elvis is no longer Hollywood. He decides he's going to strap on the leather, strap on the guitar, and he's going to start playing again. It's been a long time since he was playing. And in June of 1968, he tapes a show which would eventually become the Elvis Comeback Special, sponsored by Singer Sewing Machines. And Elvis is back December 3rd, the Elvis Comeback Special, and he didn't come back all that far. He would literally reside in Las Vegas and do all his shows in Las Vegas. And this was before My Way and before the Capes and all that. But it's a cool show to watch because he does all the 1950s stuff in that show, Elvis, the Comeback Special in 1968. And the year ends kind of on a hopeful note, maybe, with there's Frank Borman to your left, Bill Anders to your in the middle, and Tom Hanks. I'd rather Jim Lovell on the right. Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell in the Apollo 13 movie. Apollo 8 astronauts, and they circle the moon. And this is Christmas Eve, 1968. And they're going around the moon, and they're reading passages from the Bible, from Genesis, saying basically, the earth is good, don't wreck it. My friend Dick Hull, who worked for NASA between, say, 1960 and 75, was part of the 1969 lunar landing team. He was in Australia when they got the video back from the moon. He came back upside down. He had to straighten it out. He said we would have been a laughing stock had we've seen the original video, and he found out they had to flip a switch and Neil Armstrong came down. But anyway, he told me of all of the flights that he was involved with the Mercury program, Gemini program, and the Apollo program over all those years, he said that the number one in terms of getting mail from people, the number one flight where people commented on through the mail to NASA was the Apollo 8 flight because of the reading of the passages from the Bible, from Genesis, the earth is good. But they would come back to Earth in a couple of days, and they would come back and the same problems existed. The problems in 1968 don't end on December 31st. In fact, the problems in 1968 still resonate 53 years later. Nixon would become president, and Golda Meir would become prime minister in Israel, and Yasser Arafat would take over the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Assad would become the president of Syria, prime minister of Syria in 1969, and Gaddafi would be there in 1969 as well, taking over Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and riots would continue, and there'd be more in the women's rights movement and more in the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement would further splinter with no real leader. But that's 1969. Anyway, thank you, Allison, for inviting me, and thank everybody else for being here. Any questions, any comments, any criticisms? I'm all ears.
You are most welcome, always. It's just an amazing plethora of information that I did live through, but depending on the age that it was, let's see, what was I? 11. I didn't get into it as deeply as you did, so thank you for filling in those gaps. And I felt like I was there.
Well, you were there.
Yeah, true. True.
But you were probably more interested in watching the Monkees.
Oh my God, my first album. What can I tell you?
See? See, I could tell by the age. See, I could tell by the age he was a Monkees fan. They were the younger sisters.
I love it.
The Monkees.
And I watched Apollo 13, you know, the movie from Opie. Opie directed it.
Yes, yes he did.
Great movie. Great movie.
Yeah. So, anybody else?
I want to say I enjoyed it very much. I was in part of the 60s and 70s. And a lot of those things that you talked about, particularly the war in Vietnam, resonated very much in our school, because I graduated in the late 60s from high school.
Mary Jean, let me just back up. I went to public school in New York, so at 15, you're in sophomore, the trip was always, every time you hit 10th grade, you would go to Washington, D.C. for a couple of days. So at 15, I saw the Vietnam Veterans War Memorial, and it was absolutely amazing for being, we were 15, okay, we understood, but then to see somebody else's scores of people veterans, friends, family with their grief, it stopped me right in my tracks. And because I never was exposed to that. And yes, you could read the newspaper, hear it on the news, but to physically see was amazing. And then fast forward, it was probably about 10, 15 years ago, I went back for 4th of July. And I went to the memorial, and it was just so different. It almost as if we're so used to it. People were walking past, they had vendors there, popcorn, balloons, and it wasn't as sacred as I thought it was at 15. So I'm wondering, you know, things do repeat itself, but at times, do we really learn? We should carry on the reverence for things that are of such a sad magnitude, no matter what it is. Just my observation. I don't know if anybody has gone back.
Allison, I want to thank you for
Thank you.
my college years and my post-college years. It brought everything back. And this program that you have here, it just shows you that very unfortunately, history repeats itself over and over and over again. I don't know how we can change things, but I wish we could.
Good observation. And Evan, please jump in, because what happened then, we're seeing factions, issues happen right now, but there's always going to be pockets of people that disapprove, disagree, will say something against that, but in the right manner. You know, let's try to educate people. So it's always, to me, I don't mean to oversimplify, but for me, it's always good against evil. Sometimes evil gains momentum a little bit more than good. And it's that eternal struggle. And I think we're seeing a little bit more evil right now. And it's scary. I think that if we don't learn, but we should learn about how to resolve it. I mean, these issues between people probably will always continue, but our approach to finding a resolution needs to change, because as you look back at history, you're seeing that some things don't change, but we do have answers that end up being part of our fabric, and it is a positive.
Okay, I'm gonna duck off here.
Oh, well, you invite us to comment, now you're going. Well,
You can
okay,
talk
Evan,
among yourself.
we will. We'll talk about you now. Evan, thank you so much. Send me
Okay,
the
thank you.
invoice.
I will
Okay.
do. And
All right.
I will talk to you soon. And
We'll do it again.
thank you, and hope to do this again.